and a snack. Lend me your ears, and let's learn together and be productive while staying at home.
Good day, everyone. I am Faye-Ann Malate, and today we are going to have a recap on the topics discussed by the previous reporters. So there are 4 presenters for the synthesis of topics, and now we are down to the third part. So the content or the topics given to me was first, the shortcomings of GDP and nominal GDP and real GDP. Next is we have the business cycle, the theories of inflation, and next we have inflation and purchasing power of money, effects of inflation, and the last one is the price indices, consumer price index, wholesale price index, and GDP deflator. Before we proceed to the shortcomings of GDP, first let us know what is GDP or gross domestic product. So the gross domestic product is a broad monetary measure of a nation's overall economic activity, valuing all the final goods and services produced in a particular period of time, typically annually or quarterly within the country's boundaries. So this is according to Pitalcom SV Investments Ltd 2019. So these are the gross domestic product. We have personal consumption, government spending, business investment, and export imports. So here are the shortcomings of GDP and nominal and real GDP. So the shortcomings of GDP as a measure of economic growth according to Freeling 2012. Number 1, we have its inclusion of government spending alongside other voluntary market transactions, and this is most significant. Next is we have the shortcoming of GDP is that it fails to discount those economic activities that do not directly raise individual welfare. And next, the third one is the GDP has a failure to account for productive non-market activities. Next, number 4 is that the GDP is certain destructive events or activities can increase GDP while decreasing overall welfare, making the GDP an inaccurate gauge of social welfare. And number 5, it considered divorce, which can immense amount of emotional strife for those individuals involved. So the shortcomings or disadvantages of nominal GDP according to Vidya 2021. Number 1 is that it does not consider the effect of inflation. Number 2, it can compare the intricacies of price and quantity. And number 3, it doesn't compare similar results. Next is we have the shortcomings of real GDP. So the shortcomings of real GDP are 1, in health and life expectancy. And the next is in political freedom and social justice. Now we are down to the business cycle. So the business cycle is the natural rise and fall of economic growth that occurs over time. The cycle is a useful tool for analyzing the economy. It can also help us make better financial decisions. And the downward and upward fluctuations of gross domestic product or GDP along its natural growth rate over a long period of time. So this is according to Amadeo 2020. Importance of business cycle. So what is the importance of business cycle? Business cycle is important because it affects profitability, which ultimately determines whether a business succeeds. So there are 4 phases of business cycle. The first one is expansion. Next is contraction. And the third one is the peak. And the last one is the trough. Theories of inflation. So according to Halil Totonshi of 2011, there are 3 theories of inflation, which are the monetary theory, demand pull theory, and the cost push theory. First is we have the monetary. So monetary or monetarism refers to the followers of M. Friedman of 1912-2006, who hold that only money matters. And as such, monetary policy is a more potent instrument than fiscal policy in economic stabilization. Next is the demand pull theory. So demand pull is the aggregate demand comprises consumption, investment, and government expenditure. When the value of aggregate demand exceeds the value of aggregate supply at the full employment level, the inflationary gap arises. The larger the gap between aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the more rapid the inflation. So the cost push, also known as new inflation, it is caused by wage increases enforced by unions and profits increases employers, caused by the rise in money wages more rapidly than the productivity of labor. Inflation and purchasing power of money. So inflation is the decline of purchasing power of a given currency over time. A quantitative estimate of the rate at which the decline in purchasing power occurs can be reflected in the increase of an average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy over some period of time. So this is the example of inflation. So as we can see, the cup of coffee, its price arises from each period of time. Purchasing power of money. The purchasing power of money or its reciprocal, the level of prices depends exclusively on 5 definite factors. And each of these 5 magnitudes is extremely definite, and their relation to the purchasing power of money is definitely expressed by an equation of exchange. So the factors are the following: the volume of money in circulation, its velocity of circulation, the volume of bank deposits subject to check, its velocity, and the last one is the volume of trade. Effects of inflation. According to David Floyd, there are 9 common effects of inflation, and the following are: erodes purchasing power, encourages spending investing, causes more inflation, raises the cost of borrowing, cost of borrowing, reduces unemployment, increases growth, reduces employment growth, and weakens or strengthens currency. So now we are down to price indices, consumer price index, sale price index, and GDP deflator. So price indices is a measure of how price change over a period of time, or in other words, it is a way to measure inflation. And there are multiple methods on how to calculate inflation or deflation. So here are the other methods or types of price indices. Number 1, we have the Las Vegas price index. Number 2, we have the Paasche price index. Next, we have the Marshall-Edgeworth index. And number 4, we have the Fisher price index. So the Las Vegas price index have this formula. And the Paasche. Next is Marshall-Edgeworth index. So the Marshall-Edgeworth price index is the arithmetic mean simple average of the Las Vegas price index and the Paasche price index. Next is the Fisher price index. So the Fisher price index is the geometric mean of the Las Vegas price index and the Paasche price index. Consumer price index. So the consumer price index measures the average change in prices over time that consumers pay for a basket of goods and services. It is the most widely used measure of inflation and by proxy of the effectiveness of the government's economic policy. The consumer price index has 8 major groups, and the 8 major groups are the following: the housing, apparel, transportation, education and communication, other goods and services, recreation, medical care, and food and beverages. Wholesale price index. So the wholesale price index measures and tracks the changes in the price of goods before they reach consumers' goods that are sold in bulk and traded between entities or businesses rather than consumers, and are one indicator of a country's level of inflation. The GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator measures the changes in an economy. Using the GDP price deflator helps economies compare the levels of real economic activity from one year to another. So the GDP deflator has this formula. So GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP over real GDP times 100. And that's the end of my report. Thank you everyone for listening and for watching. God bless us all.